Is it possible to overcome significant adversity and have a successful career? And is the real secret to accomplishing that being selfish? I'm Christopher Lind, and professionally, I'm an industry analyst, advisor, and HR executive. But outside of work, I'm a husband and father of seven, and I live life at the intersection of business, tech, and the human experience. And to answer some of the questions that I asked just a second ago, I'm going to deconstruct another recent episode from Stephen Bartlett's Diary of a CEO. But this time I'm going to be deconstructing the conversation he had with Bozeman St. John, who is a legendary corporate executive. She's probably considered one of the most successful women in America. And transparently, in this conversation, she shared her harrowing career journey all the way back to her early start in Ghana. And honestly, I really enjoyed the conversation that he had with her. There is a lot of great information in here for folks early and late in their careers. And even though her career focus has been on marketing, I would say the applications of what she talks about can be applied in a number of different ways. Now, having listened to this conversation, this is shorter than the one I did recently with Sam Harris. This one's about an hour and a half, so it is another long form conversation, as will my deconstruction of it be. But having listened, I have a lot of reflections, both from my own career journey, but then also just having been in the HR space, having worked in developing talent my whole career. There's a lot in here, a lot that I agree with. There are some areas that I think she could have gone further with. And so I want to add some additional context and some other possible opportunities in application. However, there are some areas that we would divert when it comes to the recommendations that she's giving in this. And now, again, if I could be in that conversation, I would have loved to ask some of these follow-up questions, because sometimes the appearance of diversion can simply be the result of not having enough context or enough follow-up questions. But there is a theme. There are some themes in here that I think are consistent with the messages that we would divert on. And so I want to address those head on for folks who may be trying to navigate their own careers, just to give some additional perspective and some additional food for thought. Because I know when you hear from big names like Bozeman, it's easy to want to say, well, if that's what she did, then I should do the same. And that's actually one of the topics in here. Some of the biggest themes that came out in this discussion, and I would highly recommend checking it out. I'm a big fan of Stephen Bartlett's conversations. I promise I'm not only going to do videos responding to Diary of a CEO. I have other things that I will do as well. But the past two have been really, really relevant. Last week's, if you didn't check out my response to Sam Harris's conversation with him on ChatGPT, is at the beginning of the end. There was some really great stuff in there, and this one really hit home as well. So as I come across these, I will definitely do it. In this conversation specifically, there were some really big themes. So one, no doubt, was her overcoming adversity. And what I really appreciated about this, and you'll see as I break this down, as I go through this, I'll show little clips and respond to them so you get a flavor for the conversation. But one of the things I really appreciated about the way she talked about overcoming adversity is, while she talks about the issue, what happened, that isn't the real main focus. So for her, she's not necessarily focused on the issue of race or the death of her child or her husband or anything like that. But she really talks about what happened and then what she did about it. And I think she had no shortage of opportunity in her life, as you hear her story, to have the opposite response and take on this mentality of, I'm the recipient of all these things. But she doesn't. She really focuses on, what do I do with that? And what have I done with that? And how has it propelled me forward? And I will tell you, this is a characteristic that I see in lots of successful people. They run into adversity and it doesn't define them. Instead, it just challenges them to find a new way. And even personally, I've found some of my greatest successes have come when I haven't let adversity define me, but instead been a constraining factor that forces me to think outside the box. And so you hear that throughout the conversation. She talks a lot about what it means to build your career. And she's got an interesting story. So she actually started, or at least from the conversation, she started as the admin to Spike Lee. She was a desk assistant with Spike Lee. And you'll hear the story of how she tore apart one of the scripts that he was doing. And that really is what jump-started her career. But then she all the way ran up. She was chief brand officer for Uber. She was the chief marketing officer for Netflix. So she's had some big powerhouse roles. And she talks about the risks that she's taken along the way. And I think there's a lot of wisdom that can be unpacked from some of that. Again, there are some areas that I would go, I don't know that I would take the same path, and I don't know that I would advise that for others, but there is a lot of wisdom in this. Something else that the title leads is misleading. So the title says work-life balance is bad advice. So it sets the tone for what you're expecting in the conversation. And I will say that theme, okay, and you'll hear as I get into it more, definitely is threaded throughout the conversation, but it's much more subtle. So you're not necessarily going to hear a lot of dialogue about balancing work life, but as you hear the stories and the way she approached things, you're going to hear how she has viewed what that balance looks like. And so she shares very transparently about some of the things that she's had to navigate that cross those professional, personal boundaries, which I really appreciated. I think a lot of times there's this tendency to silo our personal life from our professional life, when in reality, it's one life. And she doesn't shy away from digging into where those lines cross. And I really appreciated that, even though the way I would potentially approach situations, and I have approached situations, we might diverge there. The last thing that is a big theme that I'll focus on, that this is where I would say we diverge the most, and I won't spoil what it is, but her perspective on the pursuit of happiness and fulfillment and where that comes from. This is where it was interesting. And again, I love listening to people who have radically different worldviews and different views than I do. I learn so much from the way they look at the world. And as you hear her stories, you can kind of piece these things together, which is why at some point, it'd be amazing to have the conversation where you could dig into some of this, because there were some things in there that I go, are you connecting that this may be what's driving you towards this outcome, and that perhaps some of the pain that you're running into is the result of this disconnect between these two things? So again, she's very candid about what she thinks the pursuit of happiness and where that comes from and how you will find success in things. So those are some of the big themes that you're going to see throughout the conversation. And now I want to just go through and highlight what I think are some of the high points and dig into this as well. So let me pull up this first one here where she talks about being a rising phoenix. And if you're not familiar with the phoenix, you'll learn it's a mythical creature. It's a bird of fire and dies, and it comes back, rises from the ashes. So you'll hear what she has to say about that right here.
Oh, gosh. Well, as a phoenix, there isn't just one rising, for me. So if there's anything to know, it is that my world has burned a few times and that I have risen every time. Now, I wouldn't say that I rise right away. It's not that kind of miracle. It's the dusting off. It's the letting the feathers grow back. It is the, can I fly again? Let me try. Ooh, this really hurts. Let me sit down. Try one more time. And then I'm off. So that means that it's everything from being, 5 years old and living in Ghana, and my father being in politics and the government being overthrown in political coup, and having to uproot ourselves out of Ghana. I mean, that my whole world burned at that point. Or it is when I was 12 and we had lived in numerous places in Africa and then moved to Colorado Springs, Colorado. And again, the world shifted and burned, and I'd have to recreate myself.
So you can see from this, and she goes into other examples through the conversation, which I really, really appreciated. But there were two things that really stood out with this that I would encourage folks to walk away from with this. And one of those things is the fact I really like the way she approached the Phoenix analogy, in that two things with it. The most successful people I have encountered recognize that their world has burned multiple times. And this is something that a lot of times from the outside you don't see with people who are highly successful, is the fact that they have had lots and lots and lots of failures along the way. And she's open about that. And I love the examples she had where her whole world burned around her. And as I reflect on my career journey, there's multiple times where my world has burned to the ground. And I think that's important for people to hear when they hear career stories and journeys from highly successful people, because there is this perception that, and if you look at her LinkedIn and track record, you'd think that her world has just been met with success after success after success, and that she's never really struggled with that. But that couldn't be further from the truth. And as she gets into her story, I so appreciate that she highlighted that. And I think more people need to hear that from successful people, that it sucks sometimes. And sometimes everything that you know has burned around you. So I appreciated that. The other thing with it that I thought was really important for people to consider, and I appreciated her sharing it, is the fact that while she says, I get back up every time, she acknowledges that doesn't happen right away. And I think this is such an important thing for people to consider when they look at things and bad times happen. Going back to, is your world going to burn? It is going to burn. It will burn at some point. It probably has already, and it will happen again. And you are going to have to get back up, but that doesn't mean that you won't need time to grieve. You won't need time to recover. You won't need time to regain your bearing. And hearing that from highly successful people, because again, there's this impression that, well, these successful people, they just get knocked over and they just stand right back up. And she talks about the fact that sometimes she doesn't, and she eventually does, but that comes with time. And I wish more people recognized and acknowledged the fact that, you know what, sometimes you need that time to recover. And I saw this a lot growing up in a funeral home, where people had this perception that they just lost the love of their life, the person that's most important to them. And they feel like, I got to just pick myself back up by the bootstraps. I have to move forward. I have to do this. And even coming from a biblical worldview, where I would look at, you don't have the strength to pick yourself back up. You need to call on someone bigger than you to do that. But even that, even in Christians, you'll see this idea that you can't be in the mud for a bit and acknowledge that I have to grieve. I have to deal. I'm not okay right now. And there's so much external pressure to just be like, but you have to be okay now. You get up. And yes, knowing that eventually I am going to have to get up, but you know what? Right now, I can't. I need time to rest. I need time to recover. If that is a message that anybody who may be going through that season right now, where the world has burned around you, that it's okay to not get up right now. Yes, you have to at some point. And I think if you're someone who's seeing someone who his world has just burned around them, having that empathy to recognize that when they're ready to get up may look different than when you're ready to get up. And she talks about empathy later on in this, but it doesn't come out right here. And I think that's a really important lesson for people. If you are the support network, or you are the person who's there for someone whose world is burning, is to remember that don't think that because in your mind you think you would be ready, or you think they should be ready, that necessarily means that they are. And that actually contributes to some of that artificial pressure to say, well, I have to be ready before I'm ready, because, and that's a very personal journey. That's a very personal journey. I think too often we try and time box it. We try and smash it into something that makes sense to us or someone else. So again, really fantastic part of the conversation. So the next part she talks about, and she's asked by Stephen about her semblance of being a chameleon. She's a bit of a chameleon and openly acknowledges that, in that she talks about how she's had to adjust and she becomes different based on this. And I'll let you watch the clip and then I'm going to respond to this. So let me just play this here.
Your desire to be able to relate to the person in front of you, is that also linked to, because it was clear when I was reading about your story that you had a very early love of culture.
Yeah.
And just like what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah. But that was survival. That wasn't this battle of like nature versus nurture.
Mm-hmm.
I think I have some of it naturally, my curiosity about people and the things that surround me in pop culture. But it was certainly nurtured. This idea of like, well, I have to understand everything that's happening in this society so I can talk to you, so I can seem normal to you. So that meant that like, okay, I have to understand American football. inside and out. Friday night lights were a big deal in Colorado. So I need to understand what's happening in the field so I don't annoy people with cheering at the wrong time. Or music, understanding what was happening at the time and being able to sing along to lyrics or argue with somebody in the hallway about my favorite pop star, or fashion. Make sure that the crease on my jeans was perfect, or the way I folded it over and doubled it up was right. All of those things are nurtured. And so it created a lifelong student of pop culture. So it means that
So I'm going to stop it there because there's a lot in this that I really did appreciate about her sharing this. And so when I say being a chameleon, she talks about the fact that she's had to learn from others. She's observed things. She's, all these other things. And that can be a really positive thing. Let me just say, being able to adapt to your environment can be a really positive thing. And I will say early in my career, I used to have this perception of, well, I don't want to adapt who I am for the environment I'm in. I should just be able to be me and be accepted for that. And I learned some lessons through the School of Hard Knocks in doing that. And I'm glad that I adapted. But I also think it can be dangerous if you're not careful, because then it can lead to this, well, what really is your identity? What does it mean to be you and you uniquely you? And it can be very difficult if you live your life trying to be someone that you're not. And so I appreciated that she talked about that journey that she's been on. Now, underneath it all, one of the things that she talks about is she has a genuine curiosity for things. And I love that, because that is a critical competency that I see in nearly every truly successful person. And when I say truly successful, I mean people who are doing well and not faking it to make it. There's a genuine curiosity. There's a desire to learn all these different things, and they have a purpose behind it. It's not just a means to an end. There is a true, genuine curiosity. And as you listen to this, later on, she talks about how her mom brought balance to that. So if you listen to the story she's on and how she learned, she adapted, she did some of these different things, Stephen pushes on, how that affected her in different ways. And she talked about the balance that she got from her parents. So her mom, she shared a story early on where she was so focused, and this is where I think the being a chameleon can overtake people, is she was so focused on fitting in with her friends. She was trying to deny her heritage when she invited her friends over, because she didn't want them to know the country she really came from and her culture. She wanted to fit in with the cool kids. And her mom was just like, no, we're not going to. If you go to their home, yes, you adapt to their environment. If they come to our home, we're not going to pretend we're someone we're not to fit in with them. And I think this brings up that healthy tension that I think everyone should walk in between having the self-confidence to be bold in who you are and what you really bring to the table and the skills you have, the life experience that you bring, while not letting that creep into arrogance. And then also not swinging to the other side of this self-deprecation where you go, yeah, I just want to fit in with everybody else. I'm going to deny everything about me. And she talks about how the people in her life, which is ironic, which I'll tell you about later, have shaped her, and her father's influence in that, and her mother's. And I think this is something that professionally, when I coach people, when I talk to people about their careers, I really try and help people navigate this line well, because if you swing too far on the pride side, you may still be successful, but it's going to be a very lonely, lonely, lonely place. And on the other side, if you are self-deprecating, you are missing opportunity, because you are uniquely talented and gifted, and you bring a lot to the equation. And if you don't see that in yourself, you are going to hold yourself back. And that is one of the things I have seen in people's careers over and over, is how often they are the greatest barrier to their own success, because they don't see what they have to offer to others. So again, I really thought that this was worth calling out. There is this temptation sometimes, this imposter syndrome, to want to copy, to pretend to be something. But we also have to be careful we don't do the opposite and go, and a good example of this I see all the time. Well, I don't wear suits, so I'm not going to dress up for an interview. Well, you kind of got to be careful because you might be inadvertently dismissing yourself from a job opportunity and things like that. And there's lots of examples. So I won't unpack all of those, but I really thought it was worth calling attention to that. Okay, so this next one, I so love what she said. And this comes from a bit of her story of how her dad had a different perspective and he influenced her initially, and that changed over time. And it's a point on leadership I think every person should hear. So let me play this one.
Certainly changed the way that I think about, my own upward mobility. That for some time I did chase titles, but the truth of the matter is that a title isn't going to give you power. A title doesn't actually give you anything. And it's like what I've learned about leadership is that you have to convince the people who are around you that you are right, that you have a good idea and that they should input into that thing. And then they will follow you. You think just because you have a chief title that somebody's going to follow you or not think you're stupid? There are plenty of people out there who have, that title and teams who don't respect them. And so for me, I think those early lessons they had their good things and their bad things, and the good things were that me understanding that my dad's understanding of what success looked like in terms of titles was not necessarily the only way.
Okay. So I really appreciated her sharing this on here in that I personally, so there's two things with it. One, I love that she deconstructed from her original perception of success that her dad framed for her, which if you listen to the whole conversation, she talks about how her dad had a very traditional idea of what success meant. So you get the right title, you get the right position, you make enough money, you do all these things, and that's what success looks like. And she quickly discovered that a title doesn't make you a leader. And I think I firmly believe this as well, and have seen this many times, that will not make you successful. And I love the point that she made about the fact that you can have a big C-suite, you can be a chief executive officer, you can be whatever, and still everyone can think you're a moron. And you still have to do work and you have to prove yourself. And there isn't this point. So from a career standpoint, something I would encourage people is don't operate under this idea that, one, you have to achieve a certain point to be a leader, to be whatever, that once you get there, then you've achieved it. You can do that now. And I love that she made that point, that the title you don't need to set some goal out here and go, once I'm there, then I've arrived. And I think that's the second half to this, is that there are lots of leaders I've encountered over the years that once they get to whatever predetermined threshold they think they need to be at, and then they've arrived, they get there and they hit cruise control, or they just kick back and take their foot off the gas. And I think that is two huge mistakes that you can take in your career. One, you don't have to be in a position to lead well. You can do that from where you are today. So if you're in a position, whatever job you're in, no matter where, and again, if you listen to this and you hear when she was the admin for Spike Lee, she was a leader there just as much as she is as the former chief marketing officer of Netflix. May there be different things that came with that territory, yes, but I think one of the things that makes her so solid is the fact that she didn't get to XYZ position and then go, there you go, I'm done. I've learned all that I have to learn. I don't have anything more to grow in, and things like this. And again, the hard work that comes with that. And I have seen people think that they got the title and people are automatically going to respect or listen to them. And it's a hard lesson real quick. And so if anything, use that time you have in the roles that you're in to learn, to build your credibility, to do it when you don't have the positional authority. You can learn so much from growing in your influence and authority before you're in the position that will lead you in solid paths once you get there. Just make sure that once you get there, you don't set on cruise control. That is one of the biggest mistakes I see with senior leaders on a regular basis. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. The next one I thought was really, really good. She talks about the paradox of having to put in effort while also recognizing the limitations you may have in control. So let me flip to this part and just play this.
Says, Mum, what advice have you got for me on finding my destiny? Like,
Mhm.
what have I got to do to actively bring it
man.
about?
Woo! Have you ever heard that statement like let go and let God?
No.
Have you heard that before?
No.
It's a very Christian thing. I feel like in the like Black church, there's a lot of that. Let go and let God. You know, as if God is just gonna just sprinkle magic dust over you, you know? And I'm like, no, I don't necessarily believe that just as a plain statement. I think the letting go is an action. You know, it's not surrender. It's not like you just lay down and it's gonna find you. You're not gonna find your destiny sitting on the couch. You know, the letting go for me is like the letting go of preconceived ideas about what it is that you are going to do.
Mhm.
Letting go of sometimes you're like trying to do something and keep hitting a wall. You're just like, oh, if I just hit it one more time, it's gonna break. Sometimes it's like, you know, that's a cement wall, right? If you just move 5 feet to the right, it's actually plaster and you're gonna go right through it. You know, it's like sometimes it's the letting go of this thought that you had, which is like, oh, I'm going to do this thing right here, is the magic. And I'll tell you this, look, it didn't just happen at that stage of my life. It's happening right now.
Okay, so I'm going to stop there because, well, for a lot of different reasons. But one of the things with it that I so appreciated is she talks about this seeming paradox of, yes, you have to contribute, and there is an aspect that you have to play in your career success, in what you want to accomplish, where you want to go. Yet at the same time, there's almost a frustrating nature of how it doesn't always go the way you think it was, and it doesn't always make sense. And an example I use from my days of teaching math is 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2 when it comes to your career and things like that. And so she talked about, it's not about letting go and just laying down. And I agree with that point. It's not about, just saying, well, I'm just going to kick back. And I think she balances it very well. She articulates some of the things where you can't just kick back and go, well, I'm just going to wait for that job to come find me. I'm just going to wait for my situation to change. Yet you also have to recognize when, okay, but I also ultimately don't have control over this. And so me trying to just force my own agenda can lead to you just wearing yourself out. Now, granted, for me, coming from a biblical worldview, I feel like the book of Ecclesiastes articulates this far better than any person I've ever heard before, which would make sense given Solomon's wisdom levels. But I think he talks about this thousands of years ago, that you can chase after everything under the sun and never get there. Yet, you also have to contribute. And as we look through biblical stories, yeah, God's in control, and yet he chooses to work through us. And so there is this strange paradox of these things. And one example Tim Mackey talks about a lot that I really like about it is, there's this idea, and I see a lot of people in their careers grabbing with 2 fists, just trying to clinch onto things. And that's not healthy, because you're not recognizing that, guess what? 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2. You may have the perfect pedigree. You may have the perfect network. You may have done all the things right, and somehow it's just not working out. And so trying to grasp and clasp at that can be very frustrating. Yet at the same time, you can't sit back with your arms crossed and go, well, I guess I'll just see what happens. And the best analogy I have heard and that I personally adhere to is, how do you reach forward and hold, but with an open palm, and recognize that I'm doing to the very best of my ability what I can, while recognizing this could very quickly get knocked out of my hand, and I'm not going to try and death grip onto it. And so obviously my worldview heavily emphasizes this, in that truly I would say there is a complete surrender, but a complete surrender isn't about kicking back and going, well, I'm just not going to do anything about, and she gives a really practical example of this. She talks later in the video, it's much later towards the end. She talks about how she tried to do this, and this has nothing to do with her career, but when she got pregnant, she had done everything to avoid getting sick. And if you listen to the podcast, she got pregnant, she lost her first child, and then she got pregnant again. And the first time she got sick. So the second time she was determined not to go through. And so she did everything right. She took all the vitamins, she worked out, she did everything, and she still got just sick. I mean, sick as sick can be. And so I think it was one of her examples of how she talks about you can do everything right and still not get what you think you are, and be okay with that. Now, one thing that I said, there are some areas where I would encourage folks to go deeper with that than she did in the conversation. Sometimes people go, okay, so I know that I have some sort of responsibility, yet I can't control things. So what are some things that I can be doing about it? And if you listen to other content that I put out and a lot of the work that I do, even in my own organization, I talk a lot about how you should be actively working at building your skills. Even there's no position you arrive at where you go, I don't need to build my skills anymore. And then on top of it, things are changing all the time. Artificial intelligence is changing things. Things that you thought you knew how to do, there may be better ways to do it now. And so to continually be driving towards, hey, how am I constantly improving? Because I'm never going to arrive. And while that can sound exhausting, it's an important factor. So how are you continually developing yourself? And what are you doing to seek out that input for where you should develop? And how are you experimenting with new things? And going back to the feedback, you'll see this is where we would probably disagree as we get further into it. You know, her perception on where that feedback should come from versus mine. I think you should be actively seeking that out from folks and taking it seriously. Now, that doesn't mean you change everything you hear from people, but you should be seeking that out. You can also be working on building your network. Now, does having all the right skills, having the right network, having experimented and thinking you have the right plan mean you will necessarily achieve career success the way you've defined it in your head? No, it doesn't. But I would just encourage people, that doesn't mean give up on it. And so for those who may listen to this, if you want further feedback or thoughts on how you can build those skills, easy ways to grow yourself, comment on the video. Feel free to DM me. I'm happy to help people with this, because I do see a lot of people in my career I've encountered where they go, I'm starting to understand this mindset of I only can control so much. And I love the point she made about, you know, you're banging your head against the wall and like 2 feet over, it's plaster. And so the two things that I see people struggle with is, when do you know to stop hitting that wall and maybe try something else and see, maybe I'm just taking the wrong approach and I need to rethink this? And when do you just need to accept that maybe the way you've defined what you think you need or what you want to accomplish isn't maybe the right thing? And you need to actually let that go and be willing to let that go. And that's not always an easy conclusion to come to. And I can say from personal experience, I'm still learning that. Okay. So this next piece, right, gets into, I said, this is where we might diverge a little bit. She talks about her perspective on when it comes to asking for advice. So I said before, one thing you can be doing always is seeking honest feedback, obviously from people you trust, who know you, not just anybody on the street. So being wise about that, but what it really means to seek advice for folks. So let me pull this clip up and we'll listen to this part.
And then you have a couple of choices in front of you. Where are you going? Which one is calling you? And then you know what people like to do? They want to write pro and con lists. They want to ask people for advice. Do you think I should do this or should I do that? Both of these are good. Why are you asking other people? They don't know. They're not living your life. They don't have the whole destiny. They have their own thing. Like, why are you asking them? And if you got quiet for a second and heard your intuition, but then again, sometimes people are scared, right? Because it's telling you to do something that you probably don't want to do. You're a little scared of it. And then you're going to choose the wrong thing.
It's hard to.
So with this one, again, there's nuance to this that I know isn't necessarily coming. And this is where I would have loved to just have a deeper dialogue with her about it and see where she really stands, because there's some conflicting things coming through with her advice. She shares stories of how she's learned so much from the feedback from her mom and from her dad and how that's influenced her. And yet she's had to recreate that on her own. And then in the same breath, she says, don't listen to anybody else because they don't know you and they don't know your circumstances. And so where she stands and the potential conflict I see in some of the advice that she gives in here, I don't know if it's just how she's thinking in the moment or if truly there's a little bit of a conflict with that. But I think there is some truth, and it's obvious through this whole interview. She is radically independent. I mean, radically independent, very self-sufficient, focused on, she says it there, trust your own intuition, follow yourself. Don't listen to other people. They don't know you like you know yourself. And I do think there's some truth in this. Do people fully know your circumstances? No. They don't have your life. They don't have to live your life. They don't have to live with the choices that you have to make. And so she later talks about the fact that, nobody knows you for who you are. You're on your own, and people give advice, but really it's just them trying to portray what they would want or what they would do on you. And I do think you need to be mindful and careful of that. You absolutely have to recognize people's biases. People maybe aren't always having the best intentions when they're giving you advice. And so there's some truth to this, that you have to be discerning and careful where that wisdom comes from and the feedback that you're taking. However, I don't agree that you shouldn't take what people say to you and you should just dismiss it and go, well, you don't know me. You don't know me. You don't. And I don't know that that's necessarily what she's getting at. I want to be charitable in my assessment of it. But she does talk a lot about her own intuition and, other people. And I'm sure she's gotten lots of bad advice. There may be some more to it. But I think we just need to be careful with that, to think that I know what's best at all times. And anybody who's saying anything to me has some sort of bend. They don't understand. They aren't really caring, because I don't agree that we always objectively see ourselves and that we're completely capable of seeing our own blind spots. Now, worldview separately, I firmly believe that really where we should be seeking our truth over our own intuition or the opinions of others is from the Bible. Like, that's where we should be going first and then filtering from there. Okay. Things like that. I don't get the sense that's the worldview she's coming from, but I think even if that's not the worldview you're coming from, there is some truth in, you need to be careful what you listen to from other people, put some wisdom, discernment into it, but also to trust that you know best in every situation and nobody can see anything that you can't. That's dangerous. I mean, I just even think back over my own life on things that if you were to really honestly, objectively sit and think about times you thought something was a good idea that you either ultimately didn't do or someone talked you out of, and you look back and go, whoa, I am so glad I did not follow through on that. I think everybody can come up with those situations. So recommending that everybody just trust with your own intuition and that'll guide you the right way, I think that's a very dangerous path to take. And not even just from a biblical worldview standpoint. I think just saying, just trust in yourself above everything else, that will lead you down a path of destruction if you go down that path. So I would caution people against that just in general, regardless of where you're coming from. And I think I can speak and reason to that out of natural law. I don't need to pull on biblical context to say, there's some pretty compelling arguments that we're pretty stupid and blind to our own stuff. And so to just say, ignore what everybody else says, only listen to yourself, that's dangerous. I think the other thing, though, that is a very, very lonely existence. Deep down, we all yearn to be known by others. And if we isolate ourselves, and the thing is you cannot be in relationship with someone if you believe that, well, I can't really listen to anything. Who wants to be in a relationship with someone who's like, I'm not interested in what you have to say. I just want you to be here and tell me everything I'm doing is great and stay out of my way because it's me against the world. First of all, you're not going to have terribly healthy relationships with others. And how lonely is that to go through life thinking it's you and you alone, and nobody out there can help you. Nobody can understand you. Nobody has anything to offer you. You're going to have to figure it out on your own. And I do think oftentimes, especially at the senior level, but I don't think it's limited to senior level positions, there can be a tendency for this. And it's why there's such a lonely existence. There's this idea that nobody gets you, nobody can help you. And that is not a fun place to be in. Now, to be fair, to be totally fair, she acknowledges the complexity and the nuance between our fickle feelings and just go with whatever you feel. And so I don't want to, hopefully the way I'm representing it doesn't make it seem like I'm saying her advice is just do whatever you feel in the moment. She acknowledges that can be dangerous, but I would say there's more danger to that. And it's not just these flighty, fickle feelings. I think there's way more risk associated with just believe in yourself and your own view and what you've come to the conclusion of on your own. And so anyway, but she does acknowledge there's nuance to it and there's more to it than she's necessarily hinting at. But I think this is an area where we would diverge on this. Okay, so the next one is a really great leadership lesson that she talks about. And I'm not going to share the whole story of her with Spike Lee and how he came in and gave her the, I won't play it. But basically he came in and he was holding a script and she said, "Hey, can I see that?" And he kind of was like, "Yeah, sure, whatever," and gave it to her. And she redlined the whole thing and she thought she was going to get fired. And ultimately it ended up propelling her career because Spike Lee was like, whoa, he saw who she was beyond what even I think she would have seen, he would have seen positionally. And I think initially he dismissed her because of the position. And then when she did what she did, ultimately it came full circle. So let me play that here.
Yeah. But I feel like also I learned something as a leader from him in that moment, that there aren't people on my team that I dismiss for lack of tenure or understanding. That there are so many people who can contribute to an idea or to a campaign, who can challenge your strategy without having more knowledge than you do of the thing. You know what I'm saying? That like there are junior people on the team that you should ask their opinion, because they're probably going to look at it from a different perspective than you ever would. And they might say something that changes the entire direction of the thing you're doing. And you should listen to them.
Sometimes.
Okay. So again, this goes back to her career story of the Spike Lee incident and how she was a nobody and he actually initially dismissed her, but ultimately took her up on it. And it played out well for her. Now, let me just tell you, what she did was a bold move. And one thing I would caution people who may listen to this, and this has nothing to do with some of the other points I was going to bring up, is she talked about how well it went for her. And I think it's great that it went that way. And there have been times I have done bold, crazy things that have played out. The part that she doesn't hit on that I would just caution people when you hear that story is that kind of stuff can also get you fired. And granted, in her story, she recognized like, oops, I may have overstepped. And she even said, I don't know that I would do that same thing again, even though at the time, knowing what I know now, I don't know that I would have quite done it. Even though it played out the way it did, I still don't know that I would have done it the same way. And I can share examples, multiple examples of the same thing in my career where I did something that was really bold, borderline stupid, and it played out all right. Going back, I don't know that I would have done the same thing, even though the outcome was good. But what I loved about her sharing this, and she clearly, and you can hear this through other parts of the story, is as a senior executive, she talks about the fact that everyone on your team's voice matter. And that is such great advice to remind you, to remind anybody that, you know what? You need to believe that other people may have better ideas than you just because they aren't positionally equal to you. And are you going to get lots of stupid ideas? Yes. And she actually talks about the fact you need to protect the good and the stupid ideas. it's not, you're going to get lots of stupid ideas. Guess what? Even the most successful leaders have lots of stupid ideas too. So to go, well, they have stupid ideas. Well, they may have some stupid ideas, but they may also have some really great ideas. And to dismiss people simply because of their position, that advice to people managers and to senior leaders, to not dismiss people because, oh, well, you don't have my experience, my exposure, you don't have my wisdom. That's a stupid move. And honestly, I can say some of the best ideas that I've had weren't mine. I mean, some of the best ideas that have been implemented under my, leadership have not been mine. They've been from totally off the wall folks, unexpected corners of like, wait, what was that idea? And over the years, I've really learned personally as well to lean into that. Now, a lot of leaders, they can be threatened by this because there's this idea that, well, if you're not the one coming up with the great ideas, or you're not the one doing all this stuff, then maybe you're failing. And if you're looking at moving up in your career, or you want to move into a people leadership role, don't buy that lie. Don't buy that lie that you have to be the smartest person in the room. The best ideas come from you. And if they don't, you're somehow not living up to it. Actually, the way I assess leaders and measure leaders is, who are the ones that actually can pull some of that brilliance and wisdom out of the most unexpected places? That to me is someone who makes a great leader, is someone who sees things that nobody else sees in other people and goes, you know what? You don't. Just as an example, right here, her example is a perfect one. Random desk admin asked to see the script of Spike Lee. I'm sure he's going, and she says this. He's like, she talks about the fact that he's like, this is one of the most complicated scripts he'd ever written. And I'm sure he's like, yeah, okay, if you can even understand what this is. But kudos to Spike for going. And when he got the red line, he didn't just go, you ruined my skin, throw it out. He read it and went, whoa, I see something here that I had missed, and I don't care who she is. This is a great contribution. So for leaders, I would encourage every leader to take that advice. And if you're an individual contributor, be bold and contribute. I think that is something that a lot of times, this goes back to my earlier point of, if you don't have that view of yourself right, of you are unique and talented and gifted, and you have something to give the world, if you don't believe that, you're not going to contribute. Now, on the flip side, if you think, oh, I'm way better than everybody in here and I just don't have the title yet, right, then you're going to fall south too. But I think if you're an individual contributor, this should be something that encourages you to say, listen. And now, granted, Stephen talks about this and I love it. He goes, think about your contribution score. And I will say this is true even for myself as I look at, people I encounter. There is like a contribution score. And if somebody notoriously is throwing out stupid ideas, normally it's pride, or normally it's they just want to add and they aren't really being thoughtful and considerate. And so there is, if you're an individual contributor, you do have to take into consideration your contribution score. Is what you're contributing adding value consistently? If not, maybe you need to think about, well, maybe I need to pull back on how much I'm contributing. If you think I have the brilliant ideas, I keep giving them, nobody's taking them. Maybe you don't have so many brilliant ideas, and maybe that's why people aren't taking them. But if you're not contributing and you go, man, I have a lot of ideas, I'm just not sharing them, this may be the encouragement you need to actually step up and contribute. Now, regardless of who you are, one of the things she talks about, and I appreciate this, is the fact that sometimes, and this goes back to the control thing, sometimes the best idea with the best laid plans, with everything mapped out exactly right, will blow up in your face. And failure is an inevitability. Sometimes it's preventable, sometimes it's not. And she talks about that. And I so appreciate that she hits on that, because for leaders, it can be easy to go, well, their contribution didn't play out. Obviously, they don't really have much value to add. And it's like, well, no, maybe that's not the case. You need to dig deeper than that. But it can also be, if you're an individual contributor and you feel like, well, I just contributed what I thought was a good idea and it blew up. Don't necessarily take that experience and go, well, now I'm going to dismiss everything and I'm not going to contribute in the future because I did once and it didn't go well. We are all failing and learning, and failure is just part of learning. Okay, so let me transition to this next piece where she opens and talks pretty explicitly about an ex-boyfriend she had and his suicide, his ultimate suicide, and how that affected her. And you're going to see how I'm going to tie this to, again, the work-life balance I mentioned at the very beginning. You hear where some of this stuff threads through how she prioritizes, but in a different way than the title would lead.
You never know what somebody's dealing with, or like, or like, call this line if, you're thinking these thoughts. And the only way I could react to it was just like, but the people who are around that person, she was like, the guilt you feel, the terrible burden you carry for the rest of your life. Like, what do those people do? It was like, what hotline exists for them? How do you manage that feeling? It is a sort of survivor's guilt to some degree.
So what I liked about this in particular is, so she shares the whole story of her ex-boyfriend's suicide and how that affected her. And again, this was another one of her Phoenix stories where her world burned and she had to pick herself back up. And I appreciated her sharing this story, but some of the things that really stood out in this that I think are worth calling out, and I appreciated how she blended personal and professional stuff in this, is as you listen to the stories of this, she talks about the people who are left behind. And I love this call out because growing up in a funeral home, I saw this firsthand so many times where the people who go through, a bad experience, yes, it's terrible for them. Now, granted, if they die, it's over for them, right? There's nothing left. And so then there's the people left behind. But you see the same thing happening in other areas where maybe the person that is negatively affected still is alive, but nobody talks about the people around them. And I think this is really important for us to think about as people when we think about the way we encounter others. And that maybe just because they're not going through something directly doesn't mean that they aren't suffering or struggling because of what someone else very close to them is going through. And I think this story from her should raise the levels of empathy that we have as human beings, and recognizing that even somebody whose story may look great may still be suffering and struggling because the people around them are suffering and struggling. And you may not see that. And oftentimes that's not talked about, because sometimes for good reasons, you want to keep the focus on the person who's really struggling and you don't want to make it about you. And I think there's a healthy way to do that. But I think there can be an unhealthy way to do it where you don't acknowledge the fact that, I'm really struggling with what's going on as well. And so I appreciated, this ties back to what I said earlier with her Phoenix thing about, sometimes it takes time, or she said it, sometimes it takes time to recover from stuff. And it might take you time to recover from stuff. And it may not have even been your situation that affected you. It may have been the situation that someone else went through that is really pulling you back. But something else she brought up in here that I think is really important. She talked about how, with her ex-boyfriend's suicide, Stephen asked her, what would you do differently? And one of the things that I so appreciated about it, she said, I wish I had asked for help. And this goes back to even what we're talking about right here about, if you're the one struggling, even though you're not the one going through the situation, it's okay to ask for help from other people. And if someone around you is struggling and you don't know what to do, don't do what she did, which she said. She's like, I wish I hadn't done this. She's just like, I don't know what to do, so it's not my problem and I'm just going to leave it. And then she finds out her boyfriend killed himself. Now, granted, she acknowledges this and I agree. You can't control others. So I can still see, even in the interview, her wrestling with some of the guilt and shame and survivor's guilt that comes along with some of the decisions that she made. I hope at some point she can let go of that and recognize, hey, okay, maybe you could have called for help or asked for help from someone else, but you can't control others. But I think this is an important thing that we oftentimes don't want to ask for help. We're afraid to ask for help. This is a good leadership lesson. There are lots of times where you may be in over your skis and you need help, but you don't want to ask for help because you're afraid to acknowledge you don't know what to do. And I think this is a really important lesson from this part of the conversation, that there can be serious consequences, really serious consequences, when you don't know what to do. And rather than ask for help, you just stick your head in the sand or go, you know what? It's not my problem. I'm just going to let it play out. And there may be times when you can change that course. And so if anything, while you can't control others, I think the big takeaway from this point is you always can care about people. You always can care about people. And care doesn't necessarily mean you take that on yourself. You make it your responsibility. But it does mean that there should be some way that you can find a way to care. And in her situation, she says, you know what, I wish I had reached out for help and told someone, hey, I think he's really struggling. I don't know what to do, but I think he needs some help, so that someone else could do it. Because based on this state of the relationship with this ex-boyfriend, it's good that she didn't involve herself. It was a bad situation. But I think her reflections on, I wish I had asked for help, were really, really, really important. And I think if anything, this section of the conversation should raise our empathy levels with everyone, because just because you can't see what somebody's dealing with doesn't mean they're not dealing with anything. Speaking of which, she talks, well, I'll come back to this one later, but there's the next section, she talks about some of the stories, and Stephen kind of gives her a hard time about meeting her husband, or her former husband. I'm trying to remember now if he's passed away or not. Anyway, so I'm just going to share this clip and then I'll respond to it here in a second.
Do you know what's really interesting? Earlier on when you talked about let go and let God, it really struck me as a relationship metaphor as well, because we go through life thinking, I want brunette with this size, this and that, and da-da-da, and I'm gonna, and we've got our blinkers on and we're too narrow for all the great people that might come along. Well, you might have met your husband or wife already, but you were just so caught up in how they were supposed to look and how much money they were supposed to have.
Come on, preach.
No, I can't.
No, but it's true. But
okay, so that was really Stephen's contribution. Then they go back and forth on this a little bit, but I really appreciated that he called this out, because it does tie back to what they were talking about earlier with, you only have so much control over things. Yet, how often are we so locked in our ways of what we think how things should go? This is how we think it should play out, or this is exactly what I've already predetermined in my head should go on. And so as a result, we miss opportunities around us because we've been far too narrow in defining what really is underneath. What is our purpose? What is our intention? And a story I'll share about this that I think has been just a really powerful one. And I've written a book. I haven't published it yet. I don't know. Publishing is more kind of a pain. So anyway, but as an example of this, so I had a childhood dream of wanting to fly, always wanted to fly. And for a long time, I had just kind of relinquished myself to the fact that I'm never going to be able to fly because, and in my mind, flying was, I just want to go over there and go up in the air and zip over those trees or go over here. Things of Superman. And I just kind of said, you know what, that's not really possible, because in my head, I had this preconceived notion of how that would work. And I just kind of ultimately decided that wasn't going to happen. And one day I decided to say, what really is it about flying that intrigues me? And that, what am I really trying to get out of this? It's the freedom, the ability to just explore untethered type of a thing. And so as I actually started digging into the core of what I really was trying to accomplish, it ultimately led me down a path where I got an HD VR drone so that I could fly. Now, granted, you might say, well, that's not really flying like you originally intended. Actually, I don't know. It meets all the criteria of what I did, but I had to relinquish my predetermined definition of what flying is. And that's what they're getting at here. And I think there are so many stories and situations, whether it's professionally or personally, where I myself have done it, or I've seen others where they paint themselves in a corner and they don't even realize they're doing it. And literally there's a walkway right out of that corner, but because they're so laser focused on, well, but I'm pretty sure for this to happen, it would have to happen like this. And so you actually miss the opportunity. That could be in a career, that could be in a relationship, that could be in whatever. It can be applied anywhere. But I love the fact that that's brought out in this, and it very much ties to my book, Relentless Intention, which is being relentlessly intentional about getting to the core of it. What are you really trying to do here? Let's say you want to be some chief level officer. Why? What are you hoping is going to come out of that? What do you think you're going to get? And once you lock in on that, you may discover that maybe being in this position or marrying this person or doing this, maybe that actually isn't the only way you can achieve that outcome. And I also think another aspect that he brings out in this is, how do we not judge people based on preconceived notions, based on what you see on the surface? And so I think there's a twofold thing. One is, how do you be radically creative, get zoned in on your purpose, your intent, and then be radically creative with how you get there? But then there's also this, how often do we judge things based on the surface level? Going back to her story with Spike Lee, how quickly could Spike Lee have just said, no, you can't read my script? Because he judged, Bozeman on the surface and just goes, no, I'm not going to let you do this. And so I think that's something we also need to be really careful about. How are we taking time to question our own assumptions, take the time to dig into the stories, get to know the people around us, truly understand the situations that we're in before we start drawing conclusions and going there. Going back to what you said before, how do you know that you should stop hitting the brick wall because there's plaster right next to it? Well, you won't if you don't take the time to do that. Okay, the next part of the conversation I want to call attention to was her sharing a little bit about her loss of her baby and then her second pregnancy. So let me play this here.
Were you ready, whatever that means, to be a mother at that point?
No. I didn't even think I wanted to be a mother.
Ever?
No. I wasn't sure that I did. I was in, my career had just begun to climb in a way that was very visible to me.
You working at Pepsi at this point?
Yes, I was working at Pepsi and having really good success. And I was, influenced by all of the societal pressures that women have in the workplace. This look, if you have a baby, it's going to slow down your career. People will look at you differently. Maybe your attentions are going to shift. And so you thought you were ambitious about your career, but let a baby come along and now all of a sudden you want the baby, you don't want the career. I didn't want anything to stop me from the ambition of getting to the top.
So I so appreciated that she shared this story, because I do think it's not often talked about. So this is related specifically to having children, in that, either it's seen as a barrier, or it's supposed to be just this wonderful thing. And there's not always a lot of room in the conversation for this middle ground. And I know I personally struggled with this. So I said I'm a father of 7, and I very much related to her story of struggling sometimes with finding out we were pregnant again and going, I don't know how I feel about this. I don't know that I share the joy that I'm supposed to, that society tells me that I'm supposed to have. And I appreciated her sharing that. And it's not talked enough about. And I wish as parents, we could have more honest and vulnerable conversations. I also appreciated the fact that she hit on really the hustle culture that exacerbates this. This idea in our culture just celebrates workaholism, where you just almost are positioned with this, well, okay, so you care about family, you want to have a family. I guess that means you don't really care that much about your career. And so I guess you're going to choose one over the other. And it hits on what I would call a false dichotomy, that there's this idea that you have to choose one or the other. And even for me, that's been a struggle of my whole career. I remember early in my career when our family started growing, being told directly, well, now that your family's growing, you're going to have to decide, are you going to want to continue growing in your career? Or are you going to give that up? Because you have to make a choice. And I remember going, says who? And that was a really difficult thing. And I still run into that now, where people seem like you have to choose one or the other. And I personally have found you don't. So if you're watching this or listening to this and thinking that, well, okay, I have kids, or I'm debating having kids, I'm trying to decide what to do, don't buy into the lie that you have to make a choice between one or, I mean, are there going to be trade-offs? You better believe it. Yeah, of course there are, but it doesn't mean you have to choose one or the other. Have I made sacrifices for one, sometimes the other? Yes, but it doesn't mean that you can't have both. Again, going back to the theme in a lot of this conversation, you may have to think radically differently about it. You may have to check really what you're hoping for and what you're looking for, because you may make choices that end up making you miserable. But I think it's really important that we have this conversation. We are more honest about the fact that, hey, you know what? Why do we as a culture put people in a position where they feel like if they want to celebrate their family and their personal priorities and their life outside of work, that somehow they're less than, somehow they're not contributing fully to the work and their career. And that doesn't have to be the case. It really doesn't. And so I would just reemphasize this message. Obviously, she ended up having another child. And I don't know that how she would view balance. It'd be the same way I would, which we'll get to here a little bit later. But I appreciated her honest, open struggle with it, and it's one I can very much relate to. The other thing that she talked about in that part of the conversation that I thought was really personal, and I appreciated it, was she talked about how much of a struggle it is because she has this perception of everything's great, everything's perfect. She's got this great career. She's got, this and that. And at the end of the day, she's still not feeling fulfilled and satisfied in that. And that's a very lonely place because you almost feel guilty about saying that because people look at you like, well, what do you mean you're not happy? You have everything everybody else says they want, and yet you're not there. There's a lot of societal pressure on that. And again, I can relate to that personally, where there have been times where and still continue to be times where, on the surface, things can look great. And sometimes it's the things that look great that actually cause some of the most heartache and some of the most struggle and pain. And yet so often we don't talk about that. And so I appreciated her honesty and her vulnerability in digging into that, into talking about what that looks like and how she's navigated that. Again, I think we've got diverging perspectives in how we would approach the situation, but I appreciate the fact that she has wrestled through that and had to say, I didn't want this to define me. And she really did deconstruct and change her perspective on this. She also talked about, the honest struggle she had when she got pregnant after losing her first child. And, she just pursued having a second one because she just couldn't deal with failing at her first. In her mind, she had failed at her first pregnancy and she wasn't going to fail again. And the thing that jumped out at me about this, and this is just feedback and advice I would give to anybody who watches and listens to this as a cautionary tale, having kids is not a task to be accomplished. It's not about you. Having kids is not a thing that you check off your bucket list, a thing that you want to do because you have some perception of, well, I want to make sure I've got the perfect family. And I see this happen a lot. People decide, okay, well, I want to have kids at this age and be done by this age, and I want this many kids. And it's really all about them. It's all about themselves. And if there's one thing, and this is again where there wasn't enough of the dialogue for me to really press on that, but I see it enough to know this happens all the time, that people view having children as a personal thing, and it's not about you. And I would just discourage anybody who's approaching children that way. If you have kids now and you're objectively reflect on it and their existence, their being, what you do for them is really, truly all about you, I would encourage you to stop right there. They are a gift. They are something that you should be pouring into for their gain, for their benefit. And again, from a biblical worldview, right, I'm coming at this going, they're a gift from God. He has put them under your care for his purpose. And so you have a responsibility and a duty to them. And that's not to serve some means, they're not an end a means to your end. And so I would just caution people on that, because I do see that a fair amount. And this interview kind of hinted at her own struggle with some of that. Again, I don't know where she is today. I don't know ultimately where she would land if I really were to press in on this, but it is an area I would encourage anyone who has children or is considering having children to take very seriously. All right. So with that, I want to transition to another point where she talks about when her marriage fell apart. So her husband and her, they had this pregnancy. The pregnancy they lost the baby. Then she was determined to have another baby and just kind of charged forward. And her world, going back to the Phoenix analogy, her world burned all over again. So let me have her tell some of this story.
Yeah, but it became a battlefield in our home and in our relationship.
So
we
she's
were no
talking about the
longer
relationship.
a team.
What was missing?
Probably empathy. I could probably just narrow it down to that. Like a very shallow understanding of what the other person was going through. It's remarkable to me now to think about it. It's like, how do two people who love each other so desperately go through the same event and cannot grieve together, can't see the other one's grief? How is that even possible?
So I'm going to stop it there, because I think that's such a powerful point to end on, is her recognition and just this struggle with, she went through and her world burned around. And again, Stephen pushes her on it. So what do you think went wrong? What went wrong that it all fell apart? And she recognized, we went through the same experience, the exact same experience. And we were on completely different pages and we're hurting in so many different ways, and we weren't sensitive to each other. And I just think, as we think about the way we treat others and we engage with other people, it's so easy to think we get it. And she hints at it. I talked about it earlier. She hints at, you got to be careful when people try and tell you what to do or give you advice or feedback, because sometimes it's, well, I see this, and so here's what you should do. And that's why I agree that you do need to be really careful with that. And if you're someone who's giving feedback and advice, be so careful that just because, even if you think, I've been through this, you haven't been through their situation in their shoes. And I think that is such an important message that everyone can walk away from. And it will just not only make you a better leader, a better employee, but a better person, to recognize that you don't understand someone's situation and you need to listen and understand and sympathize with them, because even if you think you have all the details, you don't. And so how can we be better humans to one another, better people to each other as we engage with one another? Because we don't know what people are struggling with. And even if we think we know, we don't really know, and we don't understand the complexity. And so how can we just be there for others? And I just think back to the book of Job. The friends that come, they don't end up being such great friends. But initially, for the first week, they just sit and grieve with Job. And I think about that moment and think, how can we do more of that for others and just be there and not jump to because where it goes wrong in the book of Job is when his friends start assessing his situation and going, well, I'm pretty sure it's this. Maybe you should do this. And here's where you're wrong. And that's where the whole thing falls apart, when we start playing the role of, from my worldview, the Holy Spirit. And we're in here trying to tell people how to fix it instead of just going, wow. And ultimately, she lost her husband. He died to his cancer. And, it was interesting. She talked about at the end in this, she talks about forgiveness and reconciliation. And she ties it back to this whole point of control versus letting go. But I really appreciate the fact she talked about how, because Stephen asked her, so, where did you and your husband end before things ultimately ended? And she said, we were in a good place. And she talked about it. And she said, but we had to make a choice to forgive each other. And we had to make a choice to reconcile. And I think that's such an important part. Again, growing up in a funeral home, life is so precious. You don't know what tomorrow holds. You don't know whether you have tomorrow, and you don't want to waste your time. And I would say just be so careful with this and make the choice to forgive and to reconcile. And forgiveness doesn't mean that you bring harmful people back into your life. But oftentimes that's not the case. Oftentimes we're holding on to things. And that's what she described. She described some of the pain and hurt that her and her husband were holding on to, that they eventually had to come back together and say, we want to let this go. We want to move forward from this and release this. Now, there's a clip in here that, let me see if I can find it. She talks about it. I'm gonna pull this up as I go here, and hang on here as I get into it. She talks about, and this one actually I really do want to make sure I share, because she talks about what happiness really, really looks like and how we actually get to this point. And so let's see, it's at like minute 124. 43. Okay, so I'm going to share this part because she gets into how she ultimately finds happiness in things. So let me share this.
And she knows that. And I
She's
try to
talking
instill
about
the
her
same in
daughter.
her. No one should be above her in her life. Because the thing is that, like, look, the life that you're living is yours. And I cannot be a great contributor to society. And this sounds a little like counterintuitive, but I can't be a great contributor to society. I can't be a good friend. I can't even be a good mom if I am not living the life that I want to live, if I'm not wholly happy in it. So absolutely, I'm selfish.
When you left Uber, you're quoted as saying, you don't need to be the savior. I think when referencing the state of the company, because it was going through a very tumultuous time,
Yeah.
you can save yourself too.
Yes. And save yourself first is what I should have said.
So, okay. And if you find this piece, I thought I had it queued up, but I missed the first little part of it. And he asked her, Stephen asked her directly, are you selfish? And she says, yeah. And she goes into it and she really doubles down. You heard her here, she tells her daughter, like, you need to put yourself first. You need to pursue this. You can't make anyone else happy unless you're happy first. And she really emphasizes her pursuit of personal happiness is living the life you want to live. Be selfish. When things aren't going right, think about yourself first. This is where I completely diverge from her. And again, maybe in a deeper conversation, there's more nuance to her position on this than she presents in this conversation. But this to me is one that I would specifically call out and caution people about taking this is I do not agree that self-pursuit and the pursuit of happiness, if you just serve yourself, eventually you will be happy. You won't. My experience has shown this. I can think of countless people I've encountered over my career who have bought this lie, who have gone down this path. You just do a quick Google search of some of the richest, most successful people. They have literally everything they have and want, and they're miserable. And so this idea that if you can pursue ultimately yourself and what you want in every situation, don't sacrifice, just be out for number one. That is going to lead down a path of just emptiness and brokenness and loneliness. And I just don't believe that we're put here to live a happy life and die. Just do what you want, do what makes you feel good. And again, I'm coming from a biblical worldview. So for me, I believe there's so much greater purpose. I believe we're created for his purpose in his image to do so much more than just feed our desires and pleasures and then, make it till the end of the road and then kick the dirt. But even if you don't take that same worldview I do, I can give you countless examples of people who don't share my worldview that would give the same advice and say, living for yourself, living for your pleasures, living for what makes you happy is not going to be fulfilling. And what I find a lot of times with people who go down this path is they're just on this perpetual treadmill of trying, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, maybe it's this. And it's exhausting. It's absolutely exhausting. And it's very lonely because when you're only out for yourself, who wants to be around that? Who wants to be around someone who cares about themselves and themselves alone? And anybody else can only at best come in second. that's going to be a tough marriage. That's going to be a tough friendship. That's going to be a tough working relationship. It does not end well. And I may be really intense on this one, but I have seen people go down this path so many times and end up utterly miserable that when she got to this point, I was very like, oh, I just hope that people don't take this, because on the surface, and she openly acknowledges, I've got it all figured out, all this, but I still don't have it figured out. And I think ultimately she still, based on this, is probably still chasing this idea that maybe once I just get here, if I just do this. I think of the quote from Madonna where she talks about how, she struggles with this and she always gets to that next level, and then she's happy for a little bit and then it goes away, and then she's questioning whether she's worth anything anymore. And she's always trying to get that next fix. And that is a terrible pattern of addiction to be on. Now, the truth that I think that she says in here, which is where you can take what I just said and take it too far and be totally self-deprecating, not take care of yourself, not watch out for your well-being and your mental health and all these things. That is not what I'm saying. I'm not encouraging people to be a doormat, to be abused, to be taken advantage of, to not take care of yourself. I think when we look at scripture where it says, love your neighbor as yourself, it's saying you do need to take care of yourself. Just make sure you're caring equally for others. And I think it is a hard line to walk. And I won't pretend that I walk it perfectly. I won't pretend that I've figured out all the answers. But what I do know is deep down, I firmly believe if I just said what Christopher wants should be number one in my life, and I'm just going to pursue that at all costs, and anything that goes wrong with that is just collateral damage, that is a miserable existence I would not encourage anyone to pursue. So that's probably the biggest point of disagreement that I had. And despite all the wisdom in here, and it's interesting that she took that position based on how she talks about her daughter and her husband or her former husband and all these things. And it's like, it just feels like a contradiction, even to some of her own advice and some of her own wisdom. Okay. So last point here, I really want to end on a high note with this. I think this is really brilliant. And I think it's really one of the things that anybody who would watch this interview, who would see her and see her success and all her, the great things about her and go, I want to be like that. So let me play this.
I want to focus this a little bit more. There's going to be so many young people, not so young people that are listening to this conversation now. They look at your career and they go, I want to walk that path. I want to be the CMO of the biggest companies in the world. CEO of this company. What's your parting words to those people?
Oh gosh, that's such a hard one. Because the thing is that there is no path. If somebody tells you like, do these steps in order to get to where I've got, they're lying to you. You're not going to get there based on the things I've done. The only way you're going to get there is by listening to yourself, is by following your intuition, is by doing the things that you're really good at. And leave the rest of that stuff that you're not good at, that other people are trying to advise you, leave that alone. So if there's any advice, get to know yourself better. That's it.
Okay. So again, I think there's a lot of truth in what she said, and I would add a lot of caution with it. The part that I was very excited about in showing that clip that I agree with is not to copy someone else's path. Okay. Now where she gets into what you do instead, that's where I think we diverge. But what she says about don't look at her story. Don't look at the story of someone else you aspire to and try and copy them. Can you learn from them? Absolutely. And that's even in her own advice there. She's like, don't take advice from other people. Well, then why would we even take your advice, right? You need to learn from other people. You need to learn from their experiences. You need to hear what the path and the roads they've walked and what mistakes they've made. But you can't copy it and go, well, this was Christopher's path, or this was Bozoma's path, or this was Stephen's path. And so how do I copy that and make it my own? You can't. And I agree with her point. You do need to get to know yourself, right? What she said there about getting to know yourself is really important. Self-awareness is a huge gap for a lot of people. So I agree with the fact that you can't copy someone else and that you need to have a high degree of self-awareness and be pressure testing. But I think where it goes too far is saying that getting to know yourself is ultimately the way to do it. You can be a terrible compass for your life. So yes, get to know yourself, but to think that ultimately inside you, something has all the right answers. And if you can just tap into it far enough, you'll finally figure that out. I think that will leave you waning. I think it will leave you lacking. I think it will leave you miserable. And so I think that's one of the biggest things with that yes, learn from others, forge a path that makes sense for you. But don't try and copy. But ultimately, I would say, I don't remember the exact verse, but the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And if you get to know God, he won't let you down and he doesn't change. And I think that's the problem with saying just trust yourself. If you read in the New Testament, it talks about building your foundation on a rock. You aren't a rock. You're the shifting sands. We make really crappy gods. We're terrible at it. Our opinions change, our feelings change, our circumstances change, our relationships change. Like everything is just in constant state of flux. And so to try to build something sustainable on top of that, I don't see ever going well. And I've never seen it gone well. It might for a season, might for a period of time, but usually the damage it causes is far worse than any profit or gain that comes from it. And I'm not just arguing that from a position of biblical worldview. I've seen this just from natural law, that when people just go, I'm going to trust myself and I'm going to pursue myself and do nothing but that. And I think that's ultimately going to get me success. I think you will find yourself at some point in life down a very, very miserable road and struggling to know where to go from there. But that's all I have for this conversation. Ironically, it's almost as long as the original conversation, but there's just so much in here that I think can be considered and taken and weighed as everybody's navigating this world we're in a constant state of flux now. So you're in a state of flux. The world of work is in a state of flux. AI is fluxing everything. It was already fluxing before. It's going to flux. Good grief, we're coming into election season. It's going to flux all over again. And so again, where you're rooting yourself, listen, I'm not here to try and tell everybody exactly how to do things. That's not my job. But I would encourage everybody with any of this, figure out where you're building your foundation, because you do not want to build your foundation on the wrong thing, because at some point it will get washed out from underneath you. And when it does, you're going to have to be the phoenix, and maybe there's opportunities to not have to rebuild quite as many times if you do it right the first time. So hopefully you found this helpful. If you like this content, I'd encourage you to subscribe to other videos. I will be doing some more of these, responding to some of the latest research on work trends and what's happening in the world of work. I will occasionally respond to certain podcasts or videos that I see around career, anything at the intersection of technology, business, and the human experience. But with that, I hope you found this helpful, and I hope you have a great week.